Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more Esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Mrs. Helena Blavatsky. This is the secret doctrine we are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material and a link for my book so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, let us dive in and continue our exploration of the secret doctrine with stanza 11. The civilization and destruction of the fourth and fifth races, and this one is going to be a long one, y'all. This is 25 pages, so dig in. 43. They, the Lemurians, built huge cities. It is important to note that these parentheticals are there for the clarification that she feels is necessary, but most of the time it has turned out that they are not necessarily talking about what is actually being said, right? And it is important to point this out. They, the Lemurians, built huge cities. Once again, there is no Lemuria, right? I fully believe that there was once a continent off the coast of India that extended out into the Pacific island chains. There is zero historical reason to believe that, right? The sea levels have changed. Some things, cities, are underwater. Buildings, monuments, underwater. That can be explained by a continent sinking or just the oceans rising. Either way. The continent of Lemuria is supposed, it is speculated about. But it was only like 10 years old as speculation at this point in time. And the word Lemurian does not come from anywheres in antiquity. It is entirely a made-up word that they came up with in the 1860s. And so take anything talking about the Lemurians with a grain of salt, right? That's me. I literally believe that this continent existed, that these people were there, even if they weren't called the Lemurians. But it is important to maintain there is no scientific evidence whatsoever that will lean into that other than these sunken cities and legends from the Polynesian peoples. But other than that, right, like there's no hard definitive, we have found this thing and these people called themselves Lemurians or Mu or anything along that nature. The only of the two continents which I believe existed, Lemuria and Atlantis, we have a singular record of Atlantis, and it is a fourth-hand account. And so while I believe in those things, I do believe that they were existent for the 12,000-year disaster cycle. Will tell you why. It is important to remember that there is no scientific backing for that. So, they, the Lemurians, built huge cities of rare earths and of metals they built. Out of the fires, lava, vomited. Out of the white stone of the mountains, marble, and the black stone of the subterranean fires, they cut their own images in their size and likeness and worshiped them. All right, so see what I mean about the parentheticals here? Out of the fires, vomited. That doesn't intimate lava. That is her inserting lava. Out of the white stone of the mountains, marble. That's probably correct. And the black stone of the subterranean fires, where did that come from? There is black stone. It is not subterranean fire, right? That is an assumption that you are making based upon your presuppositions for things that you already believe. I call that self-insertion. That is what is happening right there. There is no reason to believe that the white stone and the black stone are necessarily talking about not stone. Now, there are white marble, right? It's generally not pure white. There's various inclusions speckled throughout it. There is black marble. And it is entirely possible that the people that are being talked about here, not necessarily Lemurians, actually did use both white and black stones. And as a matter of fact, that is one of the things that we do have as a record from Atlantis. And so this is an insertion. This is, I believe that this was subterranean fires and not black marble or obsidian, which is kind of caused by subterranean fires. But black marble's not, right? There's various other stones of dark nature. Onyx. Onyx is not made from that. So while this is an interpretation, it does not necessarily mean that it is the correct one. Back to the text. And this is funny too. But before that, right? They cut their own images in their size and likeness and worship them. Why would you worship your own likeness? Like, even if you were divine, would you worship yourself? Does that make any sense whatsoever? Is there any reason to believe that that part would be true? Right? No matter how successful that I am, and if somebody else created a statue of me, right? I'm not going to visit that thing every day, right? It's just not going to happen. I may go when they open it up and be like, oh yeah, that's cool. Kind of. A little bit weird, but okay. I'm not going back, right? I'm not going to venerate myself. That's just simply not going to happen. So, yeah. A. As the history of the first two human races, the last of the Lemurians and the first of the future Atlanteans, proceeds, we have at this point to blend the two and speak of them for a time collectively. Here, reference is also made to the divine dynasties, such as were claimed by the Egyptians, Chaldeans, Greeks, etc., to have preceded their human kings. They are still believed in by the modern Hindus and are enumerated in their sacred books. But of those, we shall treat in their proper place. What remains to be shown is that our modern geologists are now being driven into admitting the evident existence of submerged continents. But to confess their presence is not to accept that there were men on them during those early geological periods. Footnote. This is the reason why, perhaps, even Easter Island, with its wondrous, gigantic statues, a speaking witness to a submerged continent with a civilized mankind on it, is hardly mentioned anywheres in the modern encyclopedias. Its mention is carefully avoided except in some books of travels. Modern science has an undeniable predilection for forcing upon the cultured public hypotheses built on personal hobbies as well-established evidence, for offering it guesses instead of knowledge, and calling them scientific conclusions. Its specialists will evolve 1,001 contradictory speculations rather than confess an awkward, self-evident fact, preeminent among such specialists being Haeckel and his English admirers and co-thinkers. Yet, they are authorities, we are sternly reminded. What of that? The Pope of Rome is also an authority and an infallible one for his followers, whereas the remarkable fallibility of scientific speculations is being proven periodically with every change of the moon. All right, couple of things, right? First off, Easter Island is definitely talked about today, right? Whether or not it was then, I don't know. I wasn't there. It is definitely included in every encyclopedia that I have ever bothered to look at. And believe it or not, I have looked up Easter Island in several different encyclopedias. That's a little bit weird. I understand that. But that is one of the things that has fascinated me since I was a child. These heads on the island. Now, turns out it's more than just heads. These are very tall statues, and everything from the neck down was buried underneath a lot of dirt. Now, when it was buried, why it was buried, those things are up for speculation, but it is true, there is more than just the head. Where it came from is also a little bit of a mystery. Now, there are several of the Polynesian people, which is an extensive chain, right? Extensive chain of islands. Like, people say, oh, it's just a couple of islands, and they do not understand exactly how far that can extend, right? Just Hawaii, for instance, spans pretty much from, if you were to place it side by side, from where Alaska meets Canada all the way out almost to Russia, right? That is the distance that we're talking about here. Polynesia is made up of more than just Hawaii. There are the Samoan Islands. There is a whole bunch of, and they stretch all the way up to Japan, right? There are various myths from these people across this vast distance about a cataclysm that destroyed the continent that they lived upon. And then they went looking for this one particular place, and they found it. The place that they found was Easter Island, which would have been the easternmost point of the continent of Lemuria. Not Atlantis. I understand some people think it's Atlantis, but there is no reason to believe that whatsoever, right? There are many reasons to believe that there were two continents. There is less reason to believe that Atlantis was not in the Atlantic Ocean. Secondly, these scientific conclusions. Now, in her day and time, this was 1888 when this book was written, we were still figuring a lot of things out. We still had not gotten the periodic table. We were learning how to isolate elements. Helium was merely speculation at this point in time. And so, yes, science was not finished. There were a lot of conclusions still left to go, and if you were not aware, we still have a lot of conclusions still left to go right now, 150 years later. But we have a different problem with science now than they did then, kind of. Now we have this system called peer review, right? And if you have a scientific theory, you're able to write it down, come up with some hypotheses, work through the test, replicate it, and all of this. And what should happen is independent scientists read this and they're like, oh, well, that actually worked. Let me see if I can replicate it. And then they try to replicate it. And if they can replicate it, then it becomes a working theory or even a conclusion. What we have, however, is something a little bit different. You sit down and you write your theory and you do your test and then you send it out, and if it does not comport exactly with what they already know, it is dismissed and it does not get to be peer reviewed. It is completely dismissed, whether or not you have actual reproducible results. And you're like, Pitt, that doesn't happen. And I'm going to tell you one example that you can go back and check for yourself. The Thunderbolts Project. And I say one example, but it is many examples on this one channel on YouTube. It is linked on my page. If you click on my smiling face underneath this video, you'll be brought to my page. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, I have a favorite videos section on my page, or favorite channels. One of those is Space Weather News, used to be Suspicious Observers. There's a problem. The exact same problem happens over there. But the Thunderbolts Project is doing the work. They are out there repeating the problem, right? They have literally reproduced a planet, not to scale, of course, through scientific investigation and practical application. But they cannot be published. Nobody will let them be published. It is a very funny thing. These things are reproducible. Other people are doing it in other parts of the world, and yet they still cannot get published. And that is a problem with this authority. That is a problem with the peer review system. That is the problem with having any infallible somebody sitting there making the decision that you get to say this or you don't. That is the problem that we have in science. And people like Neil deGrasse Tyson are exponentially making that problem worse. They are out there acting like they know what the fuck they're talking about, and they are spewing nonsense from their mouth as though they are a complete and total ignoramus. And yes, I am talking directly about Neil deGrasse Tyson and anyone doing the same thing as him. Carbon is plant food. Back to the text. A. Men and civilized nations, not Paleolithic savages only. Let's go back and pick up the context on that. But to confess their presence is not to accept that there were men on them during the early geological period. Men and civilized nations, not Paleolithic savages only, who, under the guidance of their divine rulers, built large cities, cultivated arts and scientists, and knew astronomy, architecture, and mathematics to perfection. This primeval civilization did not, as one may think, immediately follow their physiological transformation. Between the final evolution and the first city built, many hundred thousands of years had passed. This is entirely speculation. Yet, we find the Lemurians in their sixth subrace building their first rock cities out of stone and lava. Footnote 1. Our best modern novelists, who are neither theosophists nor spiritualists, begin to have, nevertheless, very psychological and suggestively occult dreams. Witness Mr. Lewis Stevenson in his Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, than which no grander psychological essay on the occult lines exists. There was... I'm going to say this, right? This will probably piss somebody off, but it is what it is. That was not about magic, right? It was literally, like, I understand that it was couched in the terms that he took this thing and it transformed him, right? But that was just a couching. It was literally talking about schizophrenia. It was talking about this guy who had a schizophrenic break with reality, and he was living a double life. That was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It had nothing to do with... Now, that is on the face of it, right? If you read the book, and I have read the book. I read the book in like 6th grade. What it was said was talking about psychological, right? It was talking about controlling yourself. It was talking about not giving in to the temptation to do the things that Mr. Hyde did. It was not talking about spirituality and creating potions. That was what it was couched in, so that it would be acceptable to people. And you don't have to agree with that. That's what I got from reading the book. As the rising novelist, Mr. Rider Haggard, also had a prophetic, or rather retrospective, clairvoyant dream before he wrote She, his imperial corps, the city of the dead, whose surviving living men sailed northward after the plague had killed almost a whole nation, seems to step out of its general outlines from the imperishable pages of old archaic records, or the Black Plague. I should suggest that those men who sailed north may have been the fathers of the first Egyptians, and then seems to attempt a synopsis of certain letters of a master quoted in esoteric Buddhism. For she says, "Time after time have nations, aye, and rich and strong nations, learned in the arts, been and passed away and been forgotten, so that no memory of them remains. This, the nation of Kor, is but one of several, for time eats up the work of man, unless indeed he digs in caves like the people of Kor. And then, mayhap, the sea swallows them, or the earthquake shakes them in. Yet, were not these people utterly destroyed, as I think, some few remained in other cities, for their cities were many. But the barbarians came down upon them and took their women to wife, and the race of Amahaggar, that is now, is a bastard brood of the mighty sons of Kor, and behold, it dwelleth in the tombs with its father's bones." Here, the clever novelist seems to repeat the history of all the now degraded and downfallen races of humanity. Yes, but that is not necessarily the esoteric ones, right? There have been civilizations which have risen and fallen outside of Lemuria and Atlantis. Rome, for one. Oh, I'm trying to think of what the region is in India. The Punjab. The Punjab region once was a thriving civilization and fell into utter chaos. No civilization whatsoever. That is a thing that has happened, completely separate from the climatic events that I am looking for, right? And so you are again self-inserting. This is, I want to see this here, and so I see this here. That doesn't mean that it's not true, but it means that you are trying to make it true. The geologists and anthropologists would place at the head of humanity as descendants of Homo primigenius, the ape man, of which no fossil remains are yet known to us, or ever will be, but which were probably akin to the gorilla and orang of the present day, Hegel, in answer to whose probably occultists point to another and greater probability, the one given in our text. See above. Alright, I gotta find, okay, here we were. Alright. One of the such great cities of primitive structure was built entirely of lava, some 30 miles west from where Easter Island now stretches its narrow piece of sterile ground, and was entirely destroyed by a series of volcanic eruptions. The oldest remains of Cyclopean buildings were all handiwork of the Lemurians of the last sub-races. And an occultist shows, therefore, no wonder on learning that the stone relics found on the small piece of land called Easter Island by Captain Cook are very much like the walls of the temple of Pachacamac or the ruins of Teotihuacan in Peru. The Countries of the World by Robert Brown, Volume 4, page 43, and that they were in the Cyclopean style. Now, I want to point out something that may be, right? This is speculative, so take it with a grain of salt. If there was indeed a continent that extended from Easter Island all the way over to India, right? Up north, almost to Japan, and if that island submerged, or that continent, not island, continent, submerged, the people who managed to survive would go places. Some of those places, being closer to the Asiatic continent, would be the various island chains or the continent of Asia. Some of them may have even made it into the Middle East and Central Asia and even over to Africa. Some of them settled the various Peloponnesian islands, and some of them could have made it to Peru. Right? Easter Island is not that far separated from Peru in contrast to Asia, right? There's still a great deal of distance between Easter Island and Peru, so don't get that twisted at all. But if this continent did exist and some people did survive the submersion, some of them probably made it to Peru. And if that is true, then they could have built these things, right? That's the only place I'm going. And that would explain why they built it on top of a fucking mountain, right? Machu Picchu is built way up there, right? In an almost inaccessible place on the top of a mountain range. But if your entire population was almost completely wiped out by the submersion of a continent, you would probably be looking to found your civilization in the highest points that you could possibly manage. Do you think that maybe that would be a racial fear? Do you think that maybe the survivors would have PTSD and want to build way up there for that? I do. If you look, most of the old buildings in the South American continent for sure, right? Machu Picchu, the various ones that are listed here, are built in that manner. If you are unaware, it is much harder to build the higher the elevation goes. It is harder to breathe, it is harder to move, it is harder to pull your materials from way down there to up here. There has to be a reason. This was probably the reason. And again, that is entirely speculation. That is based upon things that I have read, things that I have seen, but nothing that I can pull you a record for. Back to the text. The first large cities, however, appeared on that region of the continent, which is now known as the island of Madagascar. There were civilized people and savages in those days, as there are now. Evolution achieved its work of perfection with the former, and karma its work of destruction on the latter. The Australians and their like are the descendants of those, and again we will point out I do not hold Mrs. Blavatsky's racial discriminations. Descendants of those who, instead of vivifying the spark dropped into them by the flames, extinguished it by long generations of bestiality. Footnote. See stanza 2. This would account for the great difference and variation between the intellectual capacities of races, nations, and individual men. While incarnating and, in other cases, only informing the human vehicles evolved by the first brainless, monocelous race, the incarnating powers and principles had to make their choice between and take into account the past karmas of the monads, between which and their bodies they had to become the connecting link. Besides which, as correctly stated in Esoteric Buddhism, page 30, the fifth principle, or human intellectual soul, in the majority of mankind is not even yet fully developed. Alright, we will point out that this is one of those particular things that I do not hold. Right? The great difference and variation between the intellectual capacities of races, nations, and individual men. So anybody with lesser capacity for understanding is necessarily derived from bestiality? I'm going to go hard no on that. I'm going to attribute it more to opportunity. Right? What has happened in Western civilization is we have built upon our discoveries, and it has allowed us to reach heights that has been heretofore unknown. But that does not mean that we were special because of it. We just happened to hit the right sequence of events to bring us to where we are. It could have been guided, I will grant that, but that does not mean that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were incapable of such things. They just didn't have the opportunity for it. You can absolutely take any person from anywhere on the planet who has the capacity for understanding, because not everybody does, of any race, but if they are a normal, functioning human being, you can teach them absolutely anything that you can teach me. Now, granted, I have a little better understanding than most people, and I don't say that pridefully, it is just simply a thing. I do have a tendency to think about things more than some people, and so I have a better understanding than many of my peers right here in the United States of America who have had the opportunity. The opportunity for me and the opportunity for Aboriginal Australians is completely different. However, the opportunity for learning, completely different. Societal pressures, completely different. That doesn't mean it's because they were mated with a beast. It means because they live a different lifestyle. They don't have the knowledge because they were never exposed to the ability to gain the knowledge, not because they're stupid. Anybody who makes any decisions based upon melanin is a racist, right? If you are making decisions based upon race, you're a racist. I don't care if it's because there's too little melanin or if because there's too much melanin. It doesn't matter to me. Either way, you're a racist. If you believe that any decision needs to be made upon the color of skin, you are a racist, a full-on piece of shit. And that's okay. You can learn from that. I was once a piece of shit. I changed my ways. You can change yours too. You just need to come to the realization that all of these people are human. I mean, would you date outside of your race? No, I'm not into bestiality. I will only fuck humans. Back to the text. The Aryan nations could trace their descent through the Atlanteans from the more spiritual races of the Lemurians, in whom the Sons of Wisdom had personally incarnated. And again, I want to point out, this is not a word in antiquity. Footnote 2. It is said by Krishna, the Logos incarnate in the Bhagavad Gita. If you are incarnating the Logos, you're doing it wrong. Just the exact same way if you are anthropomorphizing God, you're doing it wrong. Right? If you're putting the limits of humanity upon the infinite, you're wrong. It is that simple. If you are putting finite on the infinite, you are changing it. It is no longer the infinite, it is now the finite. The Logos is simply the finite in motion. It is not any particular individual, not any single one. Every single second, every single millisecond, every single instance of change whatsoever is the Logos, and therefore the Logos cannot incarnate. There is no such thing as the Logos incarnate. That is not a thing, right? You can use the Logos, right? Me talking to you is using the Logos. I am literally changing things. Right? That is the Logos. But it is not exclusive to me. You can talk too. And you talking, that is the Logos as well. You thinking is the Logos. You sitting still and breathing is the Logos. Even if you don't have a single thought in your head, the Logos is change. Period. That's as simple as it gets. If you are putting a face on the Logos, if you're putting a face on God, you're doing it wrong. Then I stand on that. It is said by Krishna, the Logos incarnate, in the Bhagavad Gita, the 7 great rishis, the 4 preceding Manus, partaking of my nature, were born from my mind. From them sprang, emanated, or was born, the human race and the world. Here, by the 7 great rishis, the 7 great rupa, hierarchies, and classes of dying Kohan are meant. Let us bear in mind that the Saptarishi, the 7 rishis, are the regions of the 7 stars of the Great Bear, therefore, of the same nature as the angels of the planets, or the 7 great planetary spirits. For me, just as an aside, for me, these 7 is going to be the 7 internal chakras, right? You have 1 external, there are 8 total, but the 7 internal ones are the ones that most people deal with. That is the 7 incorporation points for you. Your base, your sacral, your solar plexus, your heart, your throat, your third eye, and your crown. Each one of them holds a separate part of you together. It is quite literally the governing force of your body. So, for me, these 7 rishis, whenever they talk about them, I don't know if I've even talked about this before in one of these studies, but whenever it's talking about the 7 rishis, to me, that is going to be the 7 chakras. Not some individual outside external force, but instead the things that incorporate you, right? That is going to be synonymous with the 7 stars, with the 7 planets, with the whatever 7, right? If it's saying 7, it means the chakras, most likely, and it is excluding the 1 extra that most people are unaware of. So, they were all reborn, all men on earth in various kalpas and races. Moreover, the 4 preceding Manus are the 4 classes of the original Arupa gods, the Kumaras, the Rudras, the Asuras, etc., who are also said to have incarnated. They are not the Prajapatis, as the first are, but they're informing principles, some of which have incarnated in men, while others have made other men simply the vehicles of their reflections. As Krishna truly says, the same words being repeated later by another vehicle of the Logos. I am the same to all beings. Those who worship me, the 6th principle or the intellectual divine soul, Buddhi, made conscious by its union with the higher faculties of Manas, are in me, and I am in them. The Logos, being no personality but the universal principle, is represented by all the divine powers born of its mind. The pure flames, or, as they are called in occultism, the intellectual breaths. Those angels who are said to have made themselves independent, in example, passed from the passive and quiescent into the active state of self-consciousness. When this is recognized, the true meaning of the Krishna becomes comprehensible. But see Mr. Sava Rowe's excellent lecture on the Bhagavad Gita. It is with the advent of the divine dynasties that the first civilizations were started. And while, in some regions of the earth, a portion of mankind preferred leading a nomadic and patriarchal life, and in others, savage man was hardly learning to build a fire and protect himself against the elements, his brothers, more favored than he by their karma, and helped by the divine intelligence which informed them, built cities and cultivated arts and sciences. Nevertheless, and civilization notwithstanding, while their pastoral brethren enjoyed wondrous powers as their birthright, they, the builders, could now obtain theirs only gradually, even these being generally used for power over physical nature and selfish and unholy purposes. Civilization has ever developed the physical and the intellectual at the cost of the psychic and spiritual. the command and the guidance over his own psychic nature, which foolish men now associate with the supernatural, were with early humanity innate and congenital, and came to man as naturally as walking and thinking. There is no such thing as magic, philosophized she, the author forgetting that magic, in her early day, still meant the great science of wisdom, and that Aisha could not possibly know anything of the modern perversion of thought, though there is such a thing as knowledge of the secrets of nature. But they have become secrets only in our race and were public property with the third. I am attempting to replace that particular concept. If you're unaware, I've got a book for sale. Magic is real. I have used it to heal myself. If you are unaware, I've got videos on that. Gradually, mankind went down in stature, for even before the real advent of the fourth, or Atlantean race, the majority of mankind had fallen into iniquity and sin, save the hierarchy of the elect, the followers and disciples of the Sons of Will in Yoga, called later the Sons of the Fire Mist. Then came the Atlanteans, the giants whose physical beauty and strength reached their climax in accordance with evolutionary law, towards the middle period of their fourth subrace. It is important to note that the historical record, the one historical record, has no record whatsoever of giants mentioned in it at all. But, as said in the commentary, the last survivors of the fair child of the White Island, the primitive Svetadweepa, had perished ages before. There, Lemuria's elect had taken shelter on the sacred island, now the fabled Shambhala in the Gobi Desert, while some of their accursed races separating from the main stock now lived in the jungles and underground. Cavemen. When the golden yellow race, the fourth, became in its turn black with sin. From pole to pole the earth had changed her face for the third time, and was no longer inhabited by the sons of Svetadweepa, the blessed, and Abdehitiana, east and west. The first and the one and the pure had become corrupted. The demigods of the third had made room for the semidemons of the fourth race. I just switched the accent. Svetadweepa, whose northern parts of the Tambahudi, the seven Kumaras, Sanaka, Sanata, Sanatana, Sanatakumara, Jatavatu, and Panchaksika, had visited agreeably with esoteric tradition, the Uttarakhanda of the Padma Purana Asiad. I know I'm all over the place. The White Island had veiled her face. Her children now lived on the Black Land, wherein later on Daityas from the seventh Dweepa, Pushkara, and Rakshas from the seventh climate replaced the sadhus and the ascetics of the third age, who had descended to them from other and higher regions. It is evident that, taken in their dead letter, the Puranas read as an absurd tissue of fairy tales, and no better. But if one reads chapter 1, 2, and 3 from Book 2, Volume 2 of Vishnu Purana and accepts verbatim its geography, geodesy, and ethnology in the matter of Priyavrata's 7 sons, among whom the father divides the 7 Dweepas, continental islands, then proceeds to study how the eldest son, the king of Jambudweepa, Agnidra, apportioned Jambudweepa among his 9 sons, and then how Nabhi, his son, who had 100 sons, and apportioned all these in his turn. Then the reader is likely to throw the book away and pronounce it a farrago of nonsense. But the esoteric student will understand that, in the days when the Puranas were written, the true meaning was clear only to the initiated Brahmins, who wrote these works allegorically, and would not give the whole truth to the masses. And he will explain to the Orientalist, who, beginning with Colonel Wilford and ending with Professor Weber, made and still are making such a mess of it, that the first 3 chapters purposely confuse the following subjects and events. 1. The series of kalpas, or ages, also of races, are never taken into account, e.g., events which have happened in one being allowed to stand along with those which took place in another. The chronological order is entirely ignored. This is shown by several of the Sanskrit commentators who explain the incompatibility of events and calculations in saying, whenever any contradictions in different Puranas are observed, they are ascribed to differences of kalpas and the like. Vishnu and Bhagavata Puranas. 2. The several meanings of the words Manvantara and Kalpa, or age, are withheld, and the general one only given. 3. In the genealogy and geography of the kings and their varashas, countries, and dweepas, they are all allowed to be regarded as terrestrial regions. Now, the truth is that, without entering into too minute details, it is easy and permissible to show that A. The 7 dweepas, apportioned to Priyavrata's septenary progeny, refer to several localities. First of all, to our planetary chain, Jambu Dweepa alone representing our globe. The 6 others are the, to us, invisible companion globes of this earth. This is shown by the very nature of the allegorical and symbolic descriptions. Jambu Dweepa is in the center of all of these so-called insular continents, and is surrounded by a sea of salt water, Lavana, whereas Plaksha, Salmalia, Kusa, Karancha, Saka, and Pushkara are surrounded severally by great seas of sugarcane juice, of wine, of clarified butter, of curds, of milk, etc., and such like metaphorical names. This is shown furthermore by B. Bhaskara Acharya, who uses expressions from the Secret Doctrine and its books in his description of the sidereal positions of all the dweepas. The Sea of Milk and the Sea of Curds, etc., meaning the Milky Way and the various congeries of nebulae, the more so since he names the country to the south of the equator Baluka, that to the north Bhuvaloka, Swar, Mahar, Jana, Tapo, and Satya Lokas, and says, those lokas are gradually attained by increasing religious merits. In example, they are various paradises. C. That this geographical division of 7 allegorical continents, islands, mountains, seas, and countries does not belong to our round, nor even to our races. The name of Bharata Varsha, India, notwithstanding, is explained in the texts themselves by the narrator of Vishnu Purana. First, he closes the first chapter by saying, Bharata, the son of Nabi, who gives his name to Bharata Varsha, or India, consigned the kingdom to his son Sumati, and abandoned his life at Salagrama. He was afterwards born again as a religious Brahmin in a distinguished family of ascetics. Under these princes, Bharata's descendants, Bharatavarsha was divided into 9 portions, and their descendants held successively possession of the country for 71 periods of the aggregate of the 4 ages, or the reign of a Manu, representing a Mahayuga of 4,320,000 years. But having said so much, Parasara suddenly explains that this was the creation of Swayambhuva Manu, by which the earth was peopled when he presided over the first Manvantara and the Kalpa of Varaha. In example, the boar incarnation or avatar. Now, every Brahmin knows that it is only with Vayavasvata Manu that our humanity began on this earth, or round. And if the Western reader turns to the subsection on the primeval Manus of humanity, he will see that Vayasvata is the 7th of the 14 Manus who preside over our planetary chain during its life cycle. An example, that representing or standing in every round for 2 Manus of the same name, a root and a seed Manu. He is the root Manu of the 4th round, hence the 7th. Wilson finds in this only an incongruity, see his Vishnu Purana, and speculates that the patriarchal genealogies are older than the chronological system of Manvantaras and Kalpas, and thus have been rather clumsily distributed amongst the different periods. It's nothing of the kind, but as Orientalists know nothing of the secret teaching, They will take everything literally and then turn around and abuse the writers of that which they do not comprehend. These genealogies embrace a period of 3.5 rounds. They speak of pre-human periods and explain the descent into generation of every Manu. The first manifested sparks of the one unity, and show, furthermore, each of these human sparks dividing into and multiplying by, first, the Patars, the human ancestors, then by human races. No being can become God, or Deva, unless he passes through the human cycles. Therefore, the sloka says, happy are those who are born, even from the latent condition of the gods, as men, in Bharatavarsha, as that is the way to final liberation. In Jambu Dweepa, Bharata is considered the best of its divisions because it is the land of the works. In it alone is it that the succession of 4 yugas, ages, the Krita, the Treta, the Dwapara, and the Kali takes place. When, therefore, Parasara, asked by Maitreya to give him the descriptions of the earth, returns again to the enumeration of the same dweepas with the same seas, etc., as those he had described in the Swayambhuva Manvantara. It is simply a blind, yet to him who reads between the lines, the 4 great races and the 5th are there, with their subdivisions, islands, and continents, some of which were called by the names of celestial lokas, and by those of other globes. Hence the confusion. All these are called by the Orientalist mythical and fabulous islands and lands. Footnote. In a lecture, Professor Pengelly, quoting Professor Oliver, makes him say that the present Atlantic Islands flora affords no substantial evidence of a former direct communication with the mainland of the New World, but himself adds that, at the same time, at some period of the Tertiary epoch, Northeast Asia was united to Northwest America, perhaps by the line where the Aleutian chain of islands now extends. Thus, occult science alone can reconcile the contradictions and hesitations of modern science. Moreover, surely, the argument for the existence of Atlantis does not rest on botany alone. Very true, some are not of this earth, but they still exist. The White Island and Atala, at all events, are no myths, since the latter was a name contemptuously applied by the earliest pioneers of the 5th race to the land of sin. Atlantis, in general, not to Plato's island alone, because Plato did not call it an island. I'm not going to hit that hammer again. Go back to Timaeus. And since the former was A, the Svetadweepa of Theogony, and B, Sakadweepa, or Atlantis, its earliest portions, in its beginnings, this was when it had yet its 7 holy rivers that washed away all sin, and its 7 districts wherein there was no dereliction of virtue, no contention, no deviation from virtue, as it was then inhabited by the caste of the Magas, that caste which even the Brahmas acknowledged as not inferior to their own, and which was the nursery of the first Zarathustra. The Brahmins are shown consulting with Gwarmahuka, on Narada's advice, who told them to invite the Magas as priest of the sun in the temple built by Samba, the reputed son of Krishna, who in reality had none. In this, the Puranas are historical, allegory notwithstanding, and occultism is stating facts. The whole story is told in Bhavshaya Purana. It is stated that, having been cured by Surya, the sun, of leprosy, Samba, having built a temple dedicated to the sun, was looking for pious Brahmins to perform the appointed rites in it, and receive donations made to the god. But Narada, this virgin ascetic whom one finds in every age in the Puranas, advised him not to do so, as Manu forbade the Brahmins to receive emoluments for the performance of religious rites. He therefore referred Samba to Gwaramukha, Whiteface, the Purohita, or family priest of Hagrasena, king of Mathura, who would tell him whom he could best employ. The priest directed Samba to invite the Magas, the worshippers of Surya, to discharge the duty. Ignorant of the place they lived in, it is Surya, the sun himself, who directs Samba to Sakadwipa, beyond the salt water. Then Samba performs the journey using Garuda, Vishnu and Krishna's vehicle, the great bird, who lands him among the Magas, etc. Now, Krishna, who lived 5,000 years ago, and Narada, who is found reborn in every cycle or race, besides Garuda, this symbol, esoterically of the great cycle, show the allegory. Yet the Magas are the Magi of Chaldea, and their class and worship were born on the earlier Atlantis in Sakadwipa, the sinless. All the Orientalists are agreed that the Magas of Sakadwipa are the forefathers of the fire-worshipping Parsis. Our quarrel with them rests, as usual, on their dwarfing hundreds of thousands to a few centuries this time. They carry the event, Narada and Samba notwithstanding, to the days of the flight of the Parsis to Gujarat, which is simply absurd, as that was in the 8th century of our era. Though the Magas of the Bhavishya Purana are credited with still living in Sakadwipa in the days of Krishna's son, yet the last of it. Plato's Atlantis had perished 6,000 years before. That is a lie. They were Mag, late of Sakadwipa, and lived in those days in Chaldea. This is an intentional confusion again. And I say that this is a lie because this is an intentional misstating of what is contained in Plato's Critias, which we have done in full, where it states that the time period of Atlantis was roughly 6,000 years from now. Not from then, but from now. That is plainly stated in the text. This is intentional confusion again. Footnote, or back to the text. The earliest pioneers of the fourth race were not Atlanteans, nor yet the human Asuras and the Rakshasas, which they became later. In those days, large portions of the future continent of Atlantis were yet part and parcel of the ocean floors. There is no reason to believe that. Lemuria, as we have called the continent of the third race, was then a gigantic land. Footnote. As shown in the introduction, it stands to reason that neither the name of Lemuria nor even Atlantis are the real archaic names of the lost continents, but have been adopted for us by the sake of clearness. Atlantis was the name given to those portions of the submerged fourth race continent which were beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and which happened to keep above water after the general cataclysm. No, the last remnants of these, Plato's Atlantis, or the Poseidon, another substitute, or rather a translation of the real name, was the last of it some 11,000 years ago. Most of the correct names of the countries and islands of both continents are given in the Puranas, but to mention them specially, as found in other more ancient works, such as Surya Siddhanta, would necessitate two lengthy explanations. If, in earlier writings, the two seem to have been too faintly disconnected, this must be due to careless reading and want of reflection. In ages hence, Europeans are referred to as Aryans, and a reader confuses them with Hindus, and the latter with the fourth race, as they live, some of them, in ancient Lanka. The blame will not fall on the writer. It covered the whole area of space from the foot of the Himalayas, which separated it from the inland sea, rolling its waves over what is now Tibet, Mongolia, and the great desert of Shkamo, Gobi, from Chittagong westward to Hardwar and eastward to Assam. From thence it stretched south across what is known to us as southern India, Ceylon, and Sumatra. Then, embracing on its way as we go south, Madagascar on its right hand and Australia and Tasmania on its left. It ran down to within a few degrees of the Antarctic Circle when, from Australia, an inland region on the mother continent in those ages, it extended far into the Pacific Ocean, not only beyond Rapa Nui, Tipe or Easter Island, which now lies at latitude 26 south and longitude 110 west. See Addenda to Book 2. This statement seems corroborated by science, even if only partially, as when discussing continental trends and showing the infra-Arctic masses trending generally with the meridian, several ancient continents are generally mentioned, though inferentially. Among such, the Mascarene continent, which included Madagascar, stretching north and south, is spoken of, and the existence of another ancient continent from Spitsbergen to the Straits of Dover, while most other parts of Europe were at sea bottom, is taught. This is in alignment with what I believe to the 12,000-year disaster cycle. Footnote. See Professor Dana's article, American Journal of Science. The latter corroborates, then, the occult teaching, which shows the now polar regions as the earliest of the seven cradles of humanity, and as the tomb of the bulk of the mankind of that region during the Third Race, when the gigantic continent of Lemuria began separating into smaller continents. So you're calling Lemuria Pangaea, or calling Pangaea Lemuria. This is due, according to the explanation in the commentary, to a decrease of velocity in the Earth's rotation. When the wheel runs at the usual rate, its extremities, the poles, agree with its middle circle, the equator. When it runs slower and tilts in every direction, there is a great disturbance on the face of the earth. The waters flow towards the two ends, and new lands arise in the middle belt, equatorial lands, while those at the ends are subject to pralayas by submersion. This leads exactly into my belief in the 12,000-year disaster cycle. Right? What she believes is a misinterpretation of what was just stated. Right? Part of the 12,000-year disaster cycle, I believe, is that the Earth will rotate. It'll rotate 90 degrees, roughly, for a variety of reasons which are outlined. But one of the effects of that is that the polar regions will now be at the equator. If that is true, then what happens is the seawater will redistribute. Parts of the world that are now above water will sink, probably even where I am sitting right here in the Mississippi River Valley. It is almost certain, as a matter of fact. This will go underwater, right? And the weight of that water will change the scope of the planet. Now, if you are unaware, our planet rotates, right? It moves in a counterclockwise motion, and that defines our day. 24 hours of rotation is one day. The circle that we are in, right, the rotation causes a bulge in the middle of the planet. It's not a perfect sphere, it's more of an ovoid. That is due to the centripetal forces of our planet spinning. When it moves, the location of that spin, like the crust moves, but the core doesn't, right? The magnetic field shifts, it causes the crust to move, but we keep moving in the same rotative pattern. What happens during that, though, when it moves like this, is the water redistributes and puts pressure in different places, and some of those places sink and other places rise. That is an explanation for many different things, the Gobi being part of it. At one point in time, large portions of our current continents were underwater. This is an explanation for that, and this right here, what we just read, leans into that. And again, thus the wheel, the earth, is subject to and regulated by the spirit of the moon for the breath of its waters, tides. Towards the close of the age, Kalpa, of a great root race, the regions of the moon, the Pitar fathers or Petrus, begin drawing hotter and thus flatten the wheel about its belt. When it goes down in some places and swells in others, and the swelling running towards the extremities, poles, new lands will arise and old ones be sucked in. Again, that leads into the 12,000-year disaster cycle. We have but to read astronomical and geological works to see the meaning of the above very clearly. Scientists, modern specialists, have ascertained the influence of the tides on the geological distribution of land and water on the planets, and the shifting of the oceans with a corresponding subsidence and rise of continents and new lands. Science knows, or thinks it knows, that this occurs periodically. Footnote. Speaking on periodical elevation and subsidence of the equatorial and polar regions and ensuing changes of climate, Mr. Winchell, professor of geology at Michigan, says, as the movements here contemplated are cyclical, the same conditions would recur again and again, and accordingly the same fauna might return again and again to the same region, with intervals of occupation by other fauna. Progressive sedimentation would preserve the records of such faunal alterations, and there would be presented the phenomena of colonies, reapparitions, and other faunal dislocations in the vertical and horizontal distribution of fossil remains. These phenomena are well known to the student of geology. What is funny is that science will deny this today. Professor Todd believes he can trace these series of oscillations back to the periods of the Earth's first incrustation. Therefore, it seems easy for science to verify the esoteric statements. We propose to treat of this at greater length in the addenda. And again, the 12,000-year disaster cycle. It is asked by some theosophists, what will Atlantis be like when raised? They, understanding from a few words in esoteric Buddhism that old continents that have been submerged will reappear. Here again there is a slight misconception. Were the same identical lands of Atlantis that were submerged to be raised again, then they would indeed be barren for ages, because the Atlantic sea bottom is covered with some 5,000 feet of chalk at present, and more is forming. A new Cretaceous formation of strata, in fact, is no reason why, when the time for a new continent to appear arrives, a geological convulsion and upraising of the sea bottom should not dispose of these 5,000 feet of chalk for the formation of some mountains, and 5,000 more come to the surface. The racial cataclysms are not Noah's deluge of 40 days, a kind of Bombay monsoon. That the periodical sinking and reappearance of the modern continents, mighty continents, now called Atlantis and Lemuria by the modern writers, is no fiction, will be demonstrated in the section in which all the proofs of the same have been collated together. The most archaic Sanskrit and Tamil works teem with references to both continents. The 7 sacred islands, Dweepas, are mentioned in the Surya Siddhanta, the oldest astronomical work in the whole world, and in the works of Asura Maya, the Atlantean astronomer whom Professor Weber has made out reincarnated in Ptolemy. Yet, it is a mistake to call these sacred islands Atlantean, as done by us. For, like everything else in the sacred Hindu books, they are made to refer to several things. The heirloom left by Priyavrata, the son of Swayambhava Manu, to his 7 sons, was not Atlantis, even though 1 or 2 of these islands survived the subsidence of their fellows, and offered shelter, ages later, to Atlanteans, whose continent had been submerged in its turn. Sorry. When originally mentioned by Parasara, Vishnu Purana, the 7 referred to an esoteric doctrine, which is explained further on. Of all the 7 islands, Jambudvipa is the only one that is terrestrial, for it is our globe. In the Puranas, every reference to the north of Meru is connected with that primeval El Dorado, now the North Polar region, which, when the magnolia blossomed there, where now we see unexplored endless desert of ice, was then a continent again. Science speaks of an ancient continent which stretched from Spitzbergen down to the Straits of Dover. The secret doctrine teaches that in the earliest geological periods, these regions formed a horseshoe-like continent, whose one end, the eastern, far more northward than North Cornwall, included Greenland, and the other being contained Bering Straits as an inland piece of ground, and descended southward in its natural trend down to the British Isles, which, in those days, must have been right under the lower curve of the semicircle. This continent was raised simultaneously with the submersion of the equatorial portion of Lemuria. Ages later, some of the Lemurian remains reappeared on the face of the oceans. Therefore, though it can be said without departing from truth that Atlantis is included in the 7 great insular continents, since the 4th race, Atlanteans, got some of the Lemurian relics and, settling on the islands, included them among their lands and continents. Yet a difference should be made and an explanation given, once that fuller and more accurate account is attempted, as in the present work. Easter Island was also taken possession of in this manner by some Atlanteans, who, having escaped from the cataclysm which befell their own land, settled on that remnant of Lemuria only to perish thereon, when destroyed in one day by its volcanic fires and lava. This may be regarded as fiction by certain geographers and geologists. To the occultists, it is history. What does science know to the contrary? Until the appearance of a map published at Blavatsky in 1522, wherein the name of America appears for the first time, the latter was believed to be part of India. Science also refuses to sanction the wild hypothesis that there was a time when the Indian peninsula at one end of the line and South America at the other were connected by a belt of islands and continents. The India of prehistoric ages was doubly connected with the 2 Americas. The lands of the ancestors of those whom Ammianus Marcellinus calls the Brahmins of Upper India stretched from Kashmir far into the now deserts of Skamo. A pedestrian from the north might then have reached, hardly wetting his feet, the Alaskan peninsula through Manchuria, across the future Gulf of Tartary, the Kurile and Aleutian Islands, while another traveler furnished with a canoe and starting from the south could have walked over from Siam, crossed the Polynesian Islands, and trudged into any part of the continent of South America. But see 5 Years of Theosophy, article Leaflets from Esoteric History. This was written from the words of a master, a rather doubtful authority for the materialist and the skeptics. But here we have one of their own flock, and a bird of the same feather, Ernest Haeckel, who in his distribution of races corroborates the statement almost verbatim. It would seem that the region on the Earth's surface where the evolution of these primitive men from the closely related Carterine apes took place must be sought either in southern Asia or eastern Africa, which, by the by, was not even in existence when the third race flourished, or in Lemuria. Lemuria is an ancient continent now sunk beneath the waters of the Indian Ocean, which, lying to the south of Asia of today, stretched on one hand eastwards to Upper India and Sunda Island, and on the other westward as far as Madagascar in Africa. See Supra and compare the pedigree of man. In the epoch we are treating of, the continent of Lemuria had already broken asunder in many places and formed new separate continents. There was, nevertheless, neither Africa nor the Americas, still less Europe in those days, all these slumbering yet on the ocean floors, nor was there much of present Asia, for the cis-Himalayan regions were covered with seas, and beyond this stretched the lotus leaves of Sweta-Deepa, the countries now called Greenland, eastern and western Siberia, etc., etc. The immense continent, which had once reigned supreme over the Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans, now consisted of huge islands which were gradually disappearing one after the other, until the final convulsion engulfed the last remains of it. Easter Isle, for instance, belongs to the earliest civilization of the third race. Submerged with the rest, a volcanic and sudden uplifting of the ocean floor raised a small relic of the archaic ages untouched, with its volcano and statues, during the Champlain epoch of the northern polar submersion, as a standing witness to the existence of Lemuria. It is said that some of the Australian tribes are the last remnants of the last descendants of the third race. In this, we are again corroborated to a degree by materialistic science. Haeckel, when speaking of Blumenbach's brown or Malay race and the Australians and Papuans, remarks, "There is much likeness between these last and the aborigines of Polynesia, that Australian island world that seems to have been once on a time a gigantic and continuous continent." It certainly was, since it stretched, during the third race, east and west, as far as where the two Americas now lie, and since the present Australia is but a portion of it, as are also a few surviving islands, sown hither and thither on the face of the Pacific, and a large bit of California, which belonged to it. Funnily enough, Haeckel, in his fantastic Pedigree of Man, considers the Australians of today as the lineal descendants almost unchanged of that second branch of the primitive human race that spread northwards, at first chiefly in Asia, from the home of man's infancy, and seems to have been the parent of all the other straight-haired races of men. The one, woolly-haired, migrated in part westward, in example to Africa and northwards to New Guinea, which countries had then, as said, no existence as yet. The other, straight-haired, was evolved farther to the north in Asia and peopled Australia. Behold, writes a master, the relics of that once great nation, Lemuria of the third race, in some of the flat-headed aborigines of your Australia. Esoteric Buddhism, page 65. But they belong to the last remnants of the seventh sub-race of the third. Professor Haeckel must also have dreamt a dream and seen for once a true vision. It is to this period that we have to look for the first appearance of the ancestors of those who are termed by us the most ancient peoples of the world, now called respectively the Aryan Hindus, the Egyptians, and the oldest Persians on the one hand, and the Chaldees and Phoenicians on the other. These were governed by the divine dynasties, in example, kings and rulers who had of mortal man only his physical appearance as it was then, but who were beings from spheres higher and more celestial than our own sphere will be, long manvanterus hence. It is useless, of course, to attempt to force their existence on skeptics. Their great pride consists in proving their patronymic denomination as Catarhindis, which fact they try to demonstrate on the alleged authority of coccyx, appended to their osacrum, that rudimentary tail which, if they only had it long enough, they would wag in joy and forever in honor of its eminent discoverer. These will remain as faithful to their ape ancestors as Christians will to tailless Adam. The secret doctrine, however, sets right on this point theosophists and students of occult sciences. If we regard the second portion of the third race as the first representatives of the really human race with solid bones, then Haeckel surmised that the evolution of the primitive men took place in either southern Asia or Lemuria, Africa, whether eastern or western being out of the question, is correct enough, if not entirely so. To be accurate, however, in the same way that the evolution of the first race from the bodies of the Pataz took place on 7 distinctly separated regions of the then only Earth at the Arctic poles, so did the ultimate transformation of the third occur. It began in those northern regions, which have just been described a few pages back as including Bering Straits, and what there then was of dry land in Central Asia, when the climate was semi-tropical, even in the Arctic regions, and most adapted to the primitive wants of nascent physical man. That region, however, has been more than once frigid and tropical in turn since the appearance of man. See the 12,000-year disaster cycle. The commentary tells us that the third race was only about the middle point of its development when the axle of the wheel tilted. The sun and moon shone no longer over the heads of that portion of the sweat-born. People knew snow, ice, and frost, and men, plants, and animals were dwarfed in their growth. Those that did not perish remained as half-grown babes. Footnote. Half-grown babes in comparison with their giant brethren on other zones. So would we now. Half-grown babes in size and intellect. This was the third pralaya of the races. Footnote. Relates to Lemuria. Which means, again, that our globe is subject to 7 periodical entire changes which go pari passu with the races. For the secret doctrine teaches that during this round there must be 7 terrestrial pralayas, 3 occasioned by the change in the inclination of the Earth's axis. It is a law which acts in its appointed time, and not at all blindly as science may think, but in strict accordance and harmony with karmic law. And again, I point you to the 12,000-year disaster cycle. In occultism, this inexorable law is referred to as the Great Adjuster. Science confesses its ignorance of the cause producing climatic vicissitudes and such changes in the axial direction, which are always followed by these vicissitudes, nor does it seem so sure of the axial changes. And being unable to account for them, it is prepared rather to deny the axial phenomena altogether than admit the intelligent karmic hand and law which could reasonably explain such sudden changes and their results. It doesn't have to be karma, right? There's no cause and effect for the part of the cycle. Now, whether or not when the cycle happens, we are always at the same point evolutionary, right? Like falling into decadence, that argument can be made, but again, there's not a whole lot of evidence of that, so it is much more likely that it is simply a cycle which happens rather than the result of karma. It has tried to account for them by various more or less fantastic speculations, one of which would be the sudden and, as imaginary, collision of our Earth with a comet, the Beauchamp's hypotheses, as the cause of all the geological revolutions. But we prefer holding to our esoteric explanation, since Fouhat is as good as any comet, having in addition universal intelligence to guide him. Thus, since via Savatas Manu humanity appeared on this earth, there have already been 4 such like axial disturbances. When the old continents, save the first one, were sucked in by the oceans, other lands appeared, and a huge mountain chains arose where there had been none before. Now, as far as I am aware, the only record of this happening in this manner is Crataeus. Once again, Plato describes in his account, which was Plato recording Solon's account, who got it from his uncle who traveled to Egypt and got it from a priest, that there have been previous cycles, and I believe he even lists 4, right? He says 4, of which the Greeks only know of the last one, which was Atlantis, right? That is the only record that I am aware of this being recorded in history at all, right? Outside of the deluge. Now, the deluge absolutely lends into what I believe with the 12,000-year disaster cycle as well, but outside of the deluge reports, right? Samaria, the Babylonian accounts, even Noah and all of that, that is the only other recording of this particular cycle happening. Now, there are scientific reasons to believe that this happens. We can go walk through them. But what was recorded was that there were at least 4, but the last one was the only one recorded. It was stated then, in that one recording that we have of this event, right, that it was just a natural cycle of progression, not necessarily having anything to do with the people of Atlantis, because, once again, the things that she describes as being from Atlantis, right? The fall into sin and sorcery and all of that, that is not recorded in the primary account, right? That is maybe recorded in the Puranas and in the Rig Vedas. I don't know. I haven't read that source material, only her reading it. So when I say that there's no other account, it is because I have not read it or come across the first-hand account, right? If it is in there, we will get there eventually, right? These studies are a lot longer than I thought they would be, but that's fine. And so if it is contained in the Vedas, that's fine. That is another account of the same thing, maybe in a different way. But the only one that I am aware of is the account written by Plato. And it does say that there is great change, right? It says that there is a cycle, that this destruction happens and has happened before, and that the Egyptians at that point in time had records of at least 4. And I'm pretty sure that that's the way that that story went. And so what she is saying here is partially true, but once again, she is couching truth in her beliefs. And again, I do believe in this cycle. I do believe that it happens. I do believe that the face of the globe will be completely changed when it happens. The face of the globe was completely changed each time. The survival of the fittest nations and races was secured through timely help, and the unfit ones, the failures, were disposed of by being swept off of the earth. Such sorting and shifting does not happen between sunset and sunrise, as one may think, but requires several thousands of years before the new house is set in order. That part is almost certainly untrue, right? Again, 12,000-year disaster cycle will give you a whole lot of information on this, but the actual change of the axis probably is going to be within hours. Like almost certainly, that is going to be within hours. Now, some of the effects can take probably a week to shake out, right? When the earth moves, the inertia of the water moving right now is going to flood large sections of the planet, right? Probably even including where I am sitting right now. That water is going to move up. It is a lot of water, and it may take a couple of days to move in one direction, and then it's going to move out. That may take a couple of more days. It almost certainly will not take thousands of years. Now, you can make the argument, possibly, that due to the salt content of the areas coming out of the ocean, that is going to take them a really long time to repopulate with terrestrial life. That's not necessarily correct for a variety of reasons, but one is, say the area of the Sargasso Sea comes above the water, right? It is raised. Well, that particular area is populated by miles deep kelp beds, right? Well, when those rise, there will be salt, right? It'll be contained in there. But that kelp bed now being exposed to the atmosphere is going to decay, and that is going to create compost. Compost is going to give a place for terrestrial life to get a nice hook into growing. Yes, the area will still be salty, but here's something that you may not know. Salt is detrimental to life in excess, right? I, every single year, go and buy a big-ass box of salt. My patio back here is made out of flagstones, and the grass grows up through it. And so every single year, I sprinkle this salt out. Every single year, I kill all of the grass. Every single year, I completely salt this area, like it's got a coat of salt across it. And every single year, I have to do the same thing because by the end of the year, the rain falling from the sky has washed that salt almost completely away. That is exactly the same thing that is going to happen. So, barring climatic exceptions such as desert conditions, say the Gobi or, the Mojave or something like that, barring that, life is going to be pretty quick. Now, that's not to say it's going to be within a year, like my patio here, but it'll probably be within a decade. Almost certainly, not several thousand years. Back to the text. The sub-races are subject to the same cleansing process, as also the side branchlets, the family races. Let one, well acquainted with astronomy and mathematics, throw a retrospective glance into the twilight and shadows of the past. Let him observe, take notes of what he knows of the history of peoples and nations, and collate their respective rises and falls with what is known of our astronomical cycles, especially with the sidereal year, equal to 25,868 of our solar years. This is not exactly, but is a close approximation of a doubling of the 12,000-year cycle. Footnote. There are other cycles, of course, cycles within cycles, and this is just that which creates such a difficulty in the calculations of racial events. The circuit of the ecliptic is completed in 25,868 years, and with regard to our Earth, it is calculated that the equinoctial point falls back 50 minutes 10 seconds annually. But there is another cycle within this one. It is said that as the apsis goes forward to meet it at the rate of 11 minutes 24 seconds annually. See the article in Astronomy and Encyclopedia Britannica. This would complete a revolution in 115,322 years. The approximation of the equinox and the apsis is the sum of these motions, 61 minutes 34 seconds. And hence the equinox returns to the same position in relation to the apsis in 21,128 years. We have mentioned this cycle in Isis Unveiled, Volume 1, which we have done in entirety, in relation to other cycles. Each has a marked influence on its contemporary race. Now, when I say that this leans into the 12,000-year disaster cycle, and I do, it is because that 12,000 years is not exact, right? It is not 12,000 years from this day, this thing is going to happen, right? For one, there is a half cycle of 6,000 years, which is another global destruction of a different nature, right? That is, again, recorded in Timaeus. This would be a doubling, roughly, of that cycle, right? Hot, cold, hot, cold. That's fine. It may even be that the periodicity of the change is 6,000 years or 12,000 years or 24,000 years. That number is an approximation based upon observable climatic changes which are not explained in other ways. And so 24,000 years, 12,000 years, 6,000 years, the numbers that I use are all estimates. The best guess that we can have. Some of them may be 25,000 years, some of them may be 23,000 years. That variability is unknown. Back to the text. If the observer is gifted with the faintest intuition, then he will find how the weal and woe of nations is intimately connected with the beginning and close of this sidereal cycle. True, the non-occultist has the disadvantage that he has no such far-distant times to rely upon. He knows nothing, through exact science, of what took place nearly 10,000 years ago, yet he may find consolation in the knowledge, or, if he so prefers, speculation, on the fate of every one of the modern nations he knows about 6,000 years hence. Our meaning is very clear. Every sidereal year, the tropics recede from the pole 4 degrees in each revolution from the equinoctial points, as the equator rounds through the zodiacal constellations. Now, as every astronomer knows at present, the tropic is only 23 degrees and a fraction less than half a degree from the equator. Hence, it has still 2.5 degrees to run before the end of the sidereal year, which gives humanity in general, and our civilized races in particular, a reprieve of about 16,000 years. That is almost certainly untrue. Footnote. At the end of this stanza on the duration of ages and cycles. After the great flood of the third race, the Lemurians, men decreased considerably in stature, and the duration of their lives was diminished. Having fallen down in godliness, they mixed with animal races and intermarried among giants and pygmies, the dwarfed races of the poles. Many acquired divine, more unlawful knowledge, and followed willingly the left-hand path. My left-hand path and their left-hand path are different things. If that's confusing, check out my book. Or become a member for cheaper and hear me read it aloud. Thus were the Atlanteans approaching destruction in their turn. How many geological periods it took to accomplish this fourth destruction, who can tell? But we are told that 44. They, the Atlanteans, built great images, 9 yatis high, 27 feet, the size of their bodies. A. Lunar fires had destroyed the land of their fathers, the Lemurians. Water threatened the fourth race. Alright, so 27 feet high, whatever, right? This is saying that they were giants. Timaeus does not, right? No point at all in Plato's writings is there a mention to these, well, to the writings that I have reviewed. There may be plenty that I have not gotten to yet, but the ones that I checked specifically because of this, right? We did Critias and Timaeus specifically because of Atlantis, because I liked it and I have theories and I wanted to talk about it. There is no record in there of them being giants at all. They are accounted as ordinary, normal men. Now, this may be true, but there is no reason outside of this source text to believe that. And in this source text, they are not called the Atlanteans. She is saying that they are the Atlanteans. That is completely different. And also, lunar fires. Lunar fires. So fire from the moon. Okay. Whatever. A. It is well worth noticing that most of the gigantic statues discovered on Easter Island, a portion of an undeniably submerged continent, also those found on the outskirts of Gobi, a region which had been submerged for untold ages, are all between 20 and 30 feet high. The statues found by Cook on Easter Island measured almost all 27 feet in height and 8 feet across the shoulders. And once again, as when we started this, I'm going to point out that this is incorrect because most of the statues were buried. The part that was out of the ground was the heads, and they were 27 feet high. The writer is well aware that the modern archaeologists have decided now that these statues are not very old. That's something that we have definitely gotten away from now, as declared by one of the high officials of the British Museum, where some of them now are. But this is one of those arbitrary decisions of modern science which does not carry much weight. We are told that it is after the destruction of Lemuria by subterranean fires, that's not lunar, that men went on steadily decreasing in stature, a process already commenced after their physical fall, and that finally, some millions of years after, they reached between 6 and 7 feet, and are now dwindling down, as the older Asiatic races, to nearer 5 than 6 feet. That was... Here's an interesting aside. In antiquity, the peoples of Europe were significantly smaller, right? Now, due to proper nutrition, people are getting larger again. That is a cycle which happens when there is more food, more availability of nutrition. People achieve greater stature. That is a thing. At this point in time, we were just coming out of a relatively cold period, and a lot more people died from starvation then than do now. And because of that, we are, once again, increasing in stature, not necessarily decreasing as a global average. Back to the text. As Pickering shows, there is in the Malay race, a subrace of the fourth root race, a singular diversity of stature. The members of the Polynesian family, Tahitian Samoans and Tonga Islanders, are of a higher stature than the rest of mankind, but the Indian tribes and inhabitants of the Indo-Chinese countries are decidedly below the general average. This is easily explained. The Polynesians belong to the very earliest of the surviving subraces. The others are the very last and transitory stock. As the Tasmanians are now completely extinct and the Australians rapidly dying out, so will the other races soon follow. They're still kicking. Now, how could those records have been preserved? We may be asked. Even the knowledge of the zodiac is denied by the Hindus of our kind and learned Orientalists, who conclude that the Aryan Hindus knew nothing of it before the Greeks brought it into the country. This uncalled-for slander was sufficiently refuted by Bailey, and what is more, by the clear evidence of facts, as not to need very much additional refutation. While the Egyptians have on their zodiacs, see Dinon's Voyage d'Egypte, irrefutable proofs of records having embraced more than 3.5 sidereal years, or about 87,000 years. The Hindu calculations cover nearly 33 such years, or 850,000 years. That's calculations, right? That is not indisputable proof, right? Math will work in forward and reverse, whether or not the inputs are correct, right? You can take two numbers that you pull out of your ass and add them together, and they will reach something else. But that doesn't mean that that is a conclusion, right? The Hindu calculations cover nearly 33 such years, or 850,000 years. So, what's that got to do with anything? Now, the Egyptians have on their zodiacs irrefutable proofs or records. That I would like to see. I would really like to see the evidence of this 87,000 years, because as far as I am aware, that is not correct. So if you have contradicting information, drop it in the box down below. I'm always looking for more information. I'm rarely looking for less. The Egyptian priests assured Herodotus that the poles of the earth and the pole of the ecliptic had formerly coincided. But, as remarked by the author of the Sphinxiad, those poor benighted Hindus have registered a knowledge of astronomy for 10 times 25,000 years since the last local flood in Asia, or Age of Horror, in the latitude of India. And they possess recorded observations from the date of the first great flood within the Aryan historical memory, that which submerged the last portions of Atlantis 850,000 years ago. The floods which preceded are, of course, more traditional than historical. The sinking and transformation of Lemuria, beginning nearly at the Arctic Circle, Norway, the third race ended its career in Lanka, or rather on that which became Lanka with the Atlanteans, the small remnant now known as Ceylon in the northern highland of ancient Lanka, while the enormous island of that name was, in the Lemurian period, a gigantic continent described a few pages back. As a master says, why should not your geologists bear in mind that under the continents explored and fathomed by them, there may be hidden deep in the fathomless, or rather unfathomed, ocean beds, other and far older continents whose strata have never been geologically explored, and that they may, some day, upset entirely their present theories? Why not admit that our present continents have, like Lemuria and Atlantis, been several times already submerged, and had the time to reappear again and bear their new groups of mankind and civilizations, and that at the first great geological upheaval, at the next cataclysm, in the series of periodical cataclysms that occur from the beginning to the end of every round, our already all top-sized continents will go down and Lemuria and Atlantis has come up again? Not the same, identical continents, of course, but pretty fucking close. But here, an explanation is needed. No confusion need arise as regards the postulation of a northern Lemuria. The prolongation of that great continent into the North Atlantic Ocean is in no way subversive to the opinions so widely held as to the site of the lost Atlantis, and one corroborates the other. It must be noted that the Lemuria, which served as the cradle of the third race, not only embraced a vast area in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, but extended in the shape of a horseshoe past Madagascar, round South Africa, then a mere fragment in the process of formation, through the Atlantic up to Norway. The great English freshwater deposit called the Weldian, which every geologist regards as the mouth of a former great river, is the bed of the main stream which drained northern Lemuria in the secondary age. The former reality of this river is a fact of science. Will its votaries acknowledge the necessity of accepting the secondary age northern Lemuria, which their data demand? Professor Berthold Seaman not only accepted the reality of such a mighty continent, but regarded Australia and Europe as formerly portions of one continent, thus corroborating our whole horseshoe doctrine already enunciated. No more striking confirmation of our position could be given than the fact that the elevated ridge in the Atlantic Basin, 9,000 feet in height, which runs for some 2,000 or 3,000 miles southwards from a point near the British island, first slopes towards South America, then shifts almost at right angles to proceed in a southeasterly line towards the African coast, whence it runs on southward towards Tristan da Cunha. This ridge is a remnant of an Atlantic continent, and, could it be traced further, would establish the reality of a submarine horseshoe junction with a former continent in the Indian Ocean. Chart adapted from the Challenger and Dolphin soundings in Mr. Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The Atlantic portion of Lemuria was the geological basis of what is generally known as Atlantis. The latter, indeed, must be regarded rather as a development of the Atlantic prolongation of Lemuria than as an entirely new mass of land upheaved to meet the special requirements of the fourth root race. Just as in the case of race evolution, so that in that of the shifting and reshifting of continental masses, no hard and fast line can be drawn where a new order ends and another begins. Continuity in natural processes is never broken. Thus, the fourth race Atlanteans were developed from a nucleus of northern Lemurian third race men, centered, roughly speaking, towards a point of land in what is now the mid-Atlantic Ocean. Their continent was formed by the coalescence of many islands and peninsulas, which were upheaved in the normal, ordinary course of time, and became ultimately the true home of the great race known as Atlanteans. After this consummation was once attained, it follows, as stated on the highest occult authority, that Lemuria should no more be confounded with the Atlantis continent than Europe with America. The above, coming from quarters so discredited by orthodox science, will of course be regarded by it as a more or less happy fiction. Even the clever works of Donnelly, already mentioned, is put aside, notwithstanding that his statements are all confined within a frame of strictly scientific proofs. But we write for the future. Discoveries in this direction will vindicate the claims of the Asiatic philosophers, who maintain that sciences, geology, ethnology, and history included, were pursued by the antediluvian nations who lived an untold number of ages ago. Future finds will justify the correctness of the present observations of such minds as H.A. Taine and Renan. The former shows that the civilizations of such archaic nations as the Egyptians, Aryans of India, Chaldeans, Chinese, and Assyrians are the result of preceding civilizations during myriads of centuries. Footnote: History of English Literature. And the latter points to the fact that Egypt, at the beginning, appears mature, old, and entirely without mythical and heroic ages, as if the country had never known youth. Its civilization has no infancy, and its art no archaic period. The civilization of the old monarchy did not begin with infancy. It was already mature. Footnote 2. Quoted in Atlantis. To this, Professor R. Owen adds that Egypt is recorded to have been a civilized and governed community before the time of Menes, and Winchell, that at the epoch of Menes the Egyptians were already a civilized and numerous people. Manetho tells us that Athothus, the son of the first king Menes, built the palace of Memphis, that he was a physician, and left anatomical books. This is quite natural if we have to believe the statements of Herodotus, who records in Euterpe that the written history of the Egyptian priests dated from about 12,000 years before his time. But what are 12,000 or even 120,000 years compared with the millions of years since elapsed since the Lemurian period? The latter, however, has not been left without witnesses, its tremendous antiquity notwithstanding. The complete records of the growth, development, social, and even political life of the Lemurians have been preserved in these secret annals. Unfortunately, few are those who can read them, and those who could would still be unable to understand the language, unless acquainted with all of the 7 kings of symbolism, for the comprehension of the occult doctrine is based on that of the 7 sciences, which sciences find their expression in the 7 different applications of the secret records to the exoteric texts. Thus, we have to deal with modes of thought on 7 entirely different planes of ideality. Every text relates to and has been rendered from one of the following standpoints. 1. The realistic plane of thought. 2. The idealistic. And 3. The purely divine or spiritual. The other planes too far transcend the average consciousness, especially of the materialistic mind, to admit of their being even symbolized in terms of ordinary phraseology. There is no purely mythical element in any of the ancient religious texts, but the mode of thought in which they were originally written has to be found out and closely adhered to during the process of interpretation. 4. It is either symbolical, archaic mode of thought, emblematical, a latter though later though very ancient mode of thought, parabolical, allegory, hieroglyphical, or again logogrammatical. The most difficult method of all, as every letter, as in the Chinese language, represents a whole word. Thus, almost every proper name, whether in the Vedas, the Book of the Dead, or the Bible, to a degree, is composed of such logograms. No one who is not initiated into the mystery of the occult religious logography can presume to know what a name in any ancient fragment means before he has mastered the meaning of every letter that composes it. How is it to be expected that the merely profane thinker, however great his erudition in orthodox symbolism, so to say, an example in that symbolism which can never get out of the old grooves of solar myth and sexual worship, shall penetrate into the arcana behind the veil? One who deals with the husk or shell of the dead letter and devotes himself to the kaleidoscopic transformation of barren word symbols could never expect to get beyond the vagaries of modern mythologists. Thus, Vyas, Vata, Zethustris, Deucalion, Noah, etc., all the head figures of the world deluges, universal and partial, astronomical or geological, all furnish in their very names the records of the causes and effects which led to the event, if one can but read them fully. All such deluges are based on events that took place in nature and stand as historical records. Therefore, whether they were sidereal, geological, or even simply allegorical, of a moral event on other and higher planes of being, this, we believe, has now been sufficiently demonstrated during the long explanation necessitated by the allegorical stanzas. To speak of a race, 9 yatis, or 27 feet high, in a work claiming a more scientific character than Jack the Giant Killer, is a somewhat unusual proceeding. Where are your proofs? The writer will be asked. In history and tradition is the answer. Traditions about a race of giants in days of old are universal. They exist in oral and written lore. India had her Danavas and Daitayas. Ceylon had her Rakshasas, and Greece her Titans. Egypt her colossal heroes. Chaldea her Isdubars, Nimrod. And the Jews their Emims of the land of Moab, with the famous giants. Anakim. Moses speaks of Og, a king who was 9 cubits high, 15 feet 4 inches, and 4 wide. And Goliath was 6 cubits and a span in height, or 10 feet 7 inches. The only difference between the revealed scripture and the evidence furnished to us by Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, Homer, Pliny, Plutarch, Philostratus, etc., is this. While some pagans mention only the skeletons of giants, dead untold ages before, relics that some of them had personally seen, the Bible interpreters unblushingly demand that geology and archaeology should believe that several countries were inhabited by such giants in the days of Moses. Giants before whom the Jews were as grasshoppers, and who still existed in the days of Yeshua and David. Unfortunately, their own chronology is in the way. Either the latter or the giants have to be given up. Of still standing witnesses to the submerged continents and the colossal men that inhabited them, there are still a few. Archaeology claims several such on this globe, though beyond wondering what these may be, it never made any serious attempt to solve the mystery. Besides the Easter Island statues mentioned already, to what epoch do the colossal statues still erect and intact near Bamiyan belong? Archaeology assigns them to the first centuries of Christianity, as usual, and errs in this as it does in many other speculations. A few words of description will show the readers what are the statues of both Easter Island and Bamiyan. We will first examine what is known of them to Orthodox science. In The Countries of the World, by Robert Brown, in Volume 4, page 43, it is stated that Tiapi, Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, is an isolated spot almost 2,000 miles from the South American coast. In length it is about 12 miles, in breadth 4, and there is an extinct crater 1,050 feet high in its center. The island abounds in craters which have been extinct for so long that no tradition of their activity remains. But who made the great stone images, which are now the chief attraction of the island to visitors? No one knows, says the reviewer. It is more than likely that they were here when the present inhabitants, a handful of Polynesian savages, arrived. Their workmanship is of a high order, and it is believed that the race who formed them were the frequenters of the natives of Peru and other portions of South America. Even at the date of Cook's visit, some of the statues, measuring 27 feet in height and 8 across the shoulders, were lying overthrown, while others, still standing, appeared much larger. One of the latter was so lofty that the shade was sufficient to shelter a party of 30 persons from the heat of the sun. The platforms on which these colossal images stood averaged from 30 to 40 feet in length, 12 to 16 broad, all built of hewn stone in the Cyclopean style, very much like the walls of the temple of Pachacamac or the ruins of Tiahuanaco in Peru. There is no reason to believe that any of the statues have been built up, bit by scaffolding erected around them, as the journal very suggestively, without explaining how they could be built otherwise, unless made by giants of the same size as the statues themselves. One of the best of these colossal images is now in the British Museum. The images at Runoroka, the only ones now found erect, are 4 in number. 3 deeply sunk in the soil, and 1 resting on the back of its head like the head of a man asleep. Their types, though all are long-headed, are different, and they are evidently meant for portraits, as the noses, the mouths, and chins differ greatly in form. Their headdress, moreover, a kind of flat cap with a back piece attached to it to cover the back portion of the head, showing that the originals were no savages of the stone period. Verily, the question may be asked, who made them? But it is not archaeology nor yet geology that is likely to answer, though the latter recognizes in the island a portion of a submerged continent. But who cut the Bamian, still more colossal statues, the tallest and most gigantic in the whole world? For Bartholdi's Statue of Liberty, now at New York, is a dwarf when compared with the largest of the 5 images. Bernays, and several learned Jesuits who have visited the place, speak of a mountain, all honeycombed with gigantic cells, with 2 immense giants cut in the same rock. They are referred to as the modern Maiotici, Beta Supra, quotation from Shu King, the last surviving witness of the Maiotici who had troubled the earth. The Jesuits are right, and the archaeologists who see Buddhas in the largest of these statues are mistaken. For all those numberless, gigantic ruins discovered one after the other in our day, all those immense avenues of colossal ruins that cross North America along and beyond the Rocky Mountains, are the work of Cyclops, the true and actual giants of old. Masses of enormous human bones were found in America near Mesorte, a celebrated modern traveler tells us, precisely on the spot which local tradition points out as the landing spot of those giants who overran America when it had hardly risen from the waters. Footnote. See also Pneumatology as Spirits. Central Asian traditions say the same of the Bamian statues. What are they, and what is the place where they have stood for countless ages, defying the cataclysms around them and even the hand of man, as in the instance of the hordes of Timur and the Vandal warriors of Nadir Shah? Bamian is a small, miserable, half-ruined town in Central Asia, halfway between Kabul and Balkh, at the foot of Kobhayababa, a huge mountain of Paropamsian, or Hindu Kush, chain, some 8,500 feet above the level of the sea. In days of old, Bamian was a portion of the ancient city of Djuzhujul, ruined and destroyed to the last stone by Genghis Khan in the 8th century. The whole valley is hemmed in by colossal rocks, which are full of partially natural and partially artificial caves and grottos, since the dwellings of Buddhist monks who had established in them their viharas. Such viharas are to be met with in profusion to this day in the rock-cut temples of India and the valleys of Jalalabad. It is at the entrance of some of these that 5 enormous statues of what is regarded as Buddha have been discovered, or rather rediscovered, in our century, and the famous Chinese traveler Huan Sang speaks of and saw them when he visited Bamian in the 7th century. When it is maintained that no larger statues exist on the whole globe, the fact is easily proven in the evidence of all the travelers who have examined them and taken their measurements. Thus, the largest is 173 feet high, or 70 feet higher than the Statue of Liberty now at New York, as the latter is only 105 feet, or 34 meters high. The famous Colossus of Rhodes itself, between whose limbs passed easily the largest vessels of those days, measured only 120 to 130 feet in height. The second statue, cut out of the rock like the first one, is only 120 feet, 15 feet taller than the said Liberty. Footnote 2. The first and second have in common with Bartholdi's statue an entrance at the foot, leading by winding staircase cut up in the rock into the heads of the statues. The eminent French archaeologist and anthropologist, the Marquis de Nedillac, justly remarks in his work, that there never was in ancient or in modern times a sculptured human figure more colossal than the first of the two. The third statue is only 60 feet high, the other two still smaller, the last one being only a little larger than the average tall man of our present race. The first and largest of the colossi represents a man draped in a kind of toga. Monsieur de Nedillac thinks that the general appearance of the figure, the lines of the head, the drapery, and especially the large hanging ears, point out undeniably that Buddha was meant to be represented. But the above proves nothing, notwithstanding the fact that most of the now existing figures of Buddha, represented in the posture of samadhi, have large drooping ears. This is a later innovation and an afterthought. The primitive idea was due to esoteric allegory. The unnaturally large ears symbolized the omniscience of wisdom and were meant as a reminder of the power of Him who knows and hears all, and whose benevolent love and attention for all creatures nothing can escape. The merciful Lord, our Master, hears the cry of agony of the smallest of the small, beyond vale and mountain, and hastens to its deliverance, says a stanza. Gautama Buddha was an Aryan Hindu, and an approach to such ears is found only among the Mongolian, Burmese, and Siamese, who, as in Cochin, distort them artificially. The Buddhist monks, who turned the grottos of the Mayatosi into viharas and cells, came into Central Asia about or in the 1st century of the Christian era, before Huansang, speaking of the colossal statue, says that the shining of the gold ornamentation that overlaid the statue, in his day, dazzled one's eyes. But of such gilding there remains not a vestige in modern times. The very drapery, in contrast to the figure itself, cut out in the standing rock, is made of plaster and modeled over the stone image. Talbot, who has made the most careful examination, found that this drapery belonged to a far later epoch. The statue itself has therefore to be assigned to a far earlier period than Buddhism. Who does it represent in such case? It may be asked. One more tradition, corroborated by written records, answers the query and explains the mystery. The Buddhist arhats and ascetics found the 5 statues and many more, now crumbled down to dust, and, as the 3 found by them in colossal niches at the entrance of their future abode, they covered the figures with plaster, and over the old, modeled new statues made to represent Lord Tathagata. The interior walls of the niches are covered to this day with bright paintings of human figures, and the sacred image of Buddha is repeated in every group. These frescoes and ornaments, which remind one of the Byzantine style of painting, are all due to the piety of the monk ascetics, like some other minor figures and rock-cut ornamentations. But the 5 statues belong to the handiwork of the initiates of the 4th race, who sought refuge, after the submersion of their continent, in the fastnesses and on the summits of Central Asian mountain chains. Moreover, the 5 statues are an imperishable record of the esoteric teachings about the gradual evolution of the races. The largest is made to represent the first race of mankind, its ethereal body being commemorated in hard everlasting stone for the instruction of future generations, as its remembrance would otherwise never have survived the Atlantean deluge. The second, 120 feet high, represents the sweat-born, and the third, measuring 60 feet, immortalizes the race that fell, and thereby inaugurated the first physical race, born of father and mother, the last descendants of which are represented in the statues found on Easter Isle. But they were only from 20 to 25 feet in stature at the epoch when Lemuria was submerged, after it had been nearly destroyed by volcanic fires. The 4th race was still smaller, though gigantic in comparison with our present 5th race, and the series culminated finally in the latter. In the following subsection on Cyclopean ruins and colossal stones as witnesses to giants. These are Then the giants of antiquity, the ante and post-Diluvian Gibborim of the Bible. They lived and flourished 1 million, rather than between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. The Anakim of Yeshua, whose hosts were as grasshoppers in comparison with him, are thus a piece of Israelite fancy, unless indeed the people of Israel claim for Yahshua an antiquity and origin in the Eocene, or at any rate in the Miocene age, and change the millenniums of their chronology into millions of years. In everything that pertains to prehistoric times, the reader ought to bear the wise words of Montaigne in mind. Saith the great French philosopher, "It is a sottish presumption to disdain and condemn that for false which unto us seemeth to bear no show of likelihood or truth, which is an ordinary fault in those who persuade themselves to be of a more sufficiency than the vulgar sort. But reason hath taught me that so resolutely to condemn a thing for false and impossible is to assume unto himself the advantage to have the bounds and limits of God's will and the power of our common mother, nature, tied to his sleeve, and that there is no greater folly in the world than to reduce them to the measure of our capacity and bounds of our sufficiency. If we term those things monsters or miracles to which our reason cannot attain, how many do such present themselves to our sight? Let us consider through what clouds and how blindfold we are led to the knowledge of most things that pass our hands. Verily, we shall find it is rather custom than science that receiveth the strangeness of them from us, and that those things, were they newly presented unto us, we should doubtless deem them as much or more unlikely and incredible than any other. A fair-minded scholar should, before denying the possibility of our history and records, search modern history, as well as the universal traditions scattered throughout ancient and modern literature, for traces left by those marvelous early races. Few among the unbelievers suspect the wealth of corroborative evidence which is found scattered about and buried even in the British Museum alone. The reader is asked to throw one more glance at the subject matter treated of in the chapter which follows. And that is going to bring us to the end of stanza 11, the civilization and destruction of the fourth and fifth races. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult topics. I understand I have some unconventional beliefs, and I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. Distinguishing what we know from what we think is important. Speculating on things is perfectly permissible. You just have to maintain speculation. Several of the things that she speculates in here can be true. Some of them are verifiably not true. Hopefully, I've been a little bit clarifying in pointing out the things which are verifiably true, and with pointing out some of the things which we can't prove are wrong, but are more than likely not correct assumptions. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that was stated. Drop it in the box down below, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is another work you would like to see me discuss or just read aloud, drop that in the box as well. And if you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Hit me with a membership or pick up a copy of my book. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.